All right, let's hear it for Golden. Can you hear me? Is that? Yeah. I hear my voice. All right, awesome. Thanks everybody. All right, so I should mention that this is not about Clint Eastwood, but I am going to talk about burning ropes, boiling cow bones, and a little blues music. What it's really about is about making tools and making tools to make tools, so that you can better understand what it is you love and love to do. So I really love blues music and slide guitar, and so recently we're actually going to get to cow parts too. So I had no idea that cow bones would have anything to do with blues and the history of blues music, and so this is also about, I think, discovering things that are right in front of your eyes that are super obvious, and you just kind of miss them because you sort of take them for granted. So we're going to get back to cow parts in a little while, but I think we'll maybe jump to the beginning. So in 1903, W.C. Handy is one of the first people to ever write about hearing slide play. So he's sleeping on a bench next to this guy who's playing with a knife, and he wakes to hear the sort of sound of the knife being dragged across the strings. And he's the guy who ends up sort of codifying blues music and creating the 12-bar blues. For me, it was about 1,180 miles away from that location in Mississippi, in Golden, Colorado, in the mountains, that I sort of first heard it. So my stepbrother returned from being in the Navy. He's on our porch, and he was really cool because he smoked cigarettes, and so he's got a lighter, and so he's playing slide, and this blew my mind. I'd never heard anybody do that before. And so, it starts with a lighter, and then I started to realize, well, maybe you could use a battery. Dwayne Allman, popularizes using a medicine bottle. And it sort of was a search for forms sort of failing to perform properly, and a little bit of like digging into history to understand where the term bottleneck slide comes from, obviously the neck of the bottle. So we kind of moved from myth to method, which is, the myth is that you tie a rope around the bottleneck and it heats up, and then you throw it in a bucket of water and it pops off. Some people talk about blowtorches, other people talk about hammers. The first thing I got to work was actually a ceramic blade on a hacksaw. All the other things don't really work, right? When you do the rope thing, it either explodes or it actually doesn't work at all. And so a lot of it was trying to separate sort of the story about what you did from what would actually work. And all the cool, dangerous things don't actually work. So you like try to because you're a guy, you're like, oh man, we're gonna light this thing on fire, Cole trying to help me. But it doesn't really work. So I turned to YouTube, and I feel like YouTube's actually really interesting right now because there's sort of this like synthetic distributed prototyping that happens. So you can watch hundreds of people doing the thing that you want to try to do, and it speeds your learning curve in a really interesting way, because I feel like you can leverage the experiences that you haven't actually had. And it turns out the best way is the most boring. So you actually use, I'm talking about mastering the obvious, right? A glass cutter, stay with me, and you score the bottle in a circle, and then you use boiling water like you were making tea, which is really dangerous, and then cold water. And you just shock the bottle, and the thing flops right off. Like it looks like magic. The problem is that getting the score in the right place, in the right position, in the right angle is actually kind of difficult. So leveraging my sort of lame UX, sort of digital design experience, I was like, oh, well, I can prototype this for the first time, right? So I built a foam core box. I'm sorry, architects, this is really crude, but I built a foam core box to keep the slide in the right place. And so finally I ended up making it out of wood, and I got it to actually work. The thing that I was able to leverage from YouTube is I watched enough videos to know that when the bottle gets all the way around to the right revolution, you hear this really distinct click. But I never did that firsthand, and it just worked because I could know what I was listening for in kind of an interesting way. So I started to get the process working. Then I tried to iterate on this. Never tried that with most of my construction projects. I just make one and it's kind of terrible. So I realized that the bottle was sort of shifting, I guess, on the other axis. So I realized you had to add this little sort of neck support. So a lot of it's been trying to understand how to make sort of the perfect one. That's kind of been like the goal is how to do that. And so the problem was I actually did that one night. I made this perfect one. I got the edge perfect. It works great. And I realized that there are like other surfaces. I had never really hadn't thought about any other of the formal characteristics. I was just so concerned about this. And I realized that I was kind of trying to pursue this perfection that you actually can get if you just buy a basic slide. What I realized is that actually using it and understanding the other dimensions, thickness, weight, length, was actually a really critical step that I was missing. And so I started to actually use them and realize like what didn't work. So YouTube's amazing. I don't work for YouTube, but you got to check this thing out. So there are people from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s you can watch them playing slide guitar and actually see what they've done. And the thing that's really interesting is they're very different from the crappy slides you buy in the store. But if you add that into the prototyping loop, you sort of see distinctions that were made that you wouldn't have made. So, okay, so back to the bone stuff. So we went to the Poconos. It's kind of a strange place. There happened to be this guitar that I didn't know was going to be there when we were taking a little weekend trip. I didn't have a slide. I was kind of pissed off that I wasn't able to play slide. And I was sitting trying to figure out, like, well, what could I repurpose from this room? My dog's sitting there chewing on something. Turns out a dog bone, right? Well, Mississippi Fred McDowell talked about growing up using beef bones a lot, and I could never figure out what bone. And I'm maybe not the smartest guy, so I just could not imagine what possible bone you could put your finger in until I'm watching my dog chew on it. And that's when I realized, oh, that bone. But because it was a constraint, I actually didn't have another choice. I had to use it. It was very clumsy, but I ended up sort of realizing how to carve one down to the right form. So this is sort of a slide about material sources that I started to learn about as I was trying to make these things. So one is you can go to a butcher and they just have these things. They'll sell them to you, and instead of sort of wondering forever where you could get such a bone. Okay, so what's the point? So I think something really special happens when you learn to make something that makes something you care about, because I'm free of all the constraints that the sort of original traditional blues musicians had. So only by way of forcing myself to understand those constraints do I actually understand how they played the music I've been trying to learn how to play forever. So I think the point is that if you do something that you really care about, you should figure out how to remove yourself of the constraints you feel like you have today and try to understand the constraints someone else had before. So Cole's out in the audience. We recently built a single string diddly bow, which is awesome. And yeah, so I'm kind of learning how to understand that context.